reform.
So, Alexei, Steve Kornacki of the Big Board fame has some remarkable stats on how abortion rights supporters pulled it off. The numbers of no voters is almost 90,000 more than the number of Democrats and independent voters in the primary, which means that nearly 20% of no voters were, guess who? Republicans. So we're looking at a bipartisan coalition of voters who came out against this measure, aren't we?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it goes back to what the Congresswoman and Ashley were saying, that this issue cuts across lines, gender, socioeconomic status. Really, abortion is something that affects everyone. And you either know someone who's had one, you've had one yourself. It's very tangible, unlike some other issues that people might care about or be talking about. And the other thing, as I was mentioning, is that a lot of the branding and messaging from Democrats and pro-abortion folks on this constitutional amendment, again, was more focused on whether or not you as a voter in Kansas wanted to see changes to your state constitution. Of course, people knew it was for abortion protections or getting rid of them, but they also know that that language is something that will appeal to Republicans, as we've seen, in addition to Democrats.
Don, I want to play for you some remarks from Kansas Democratic Congresswoman Sharice Davids, who was with us on Morning Joe this morning, on how Democrats and pro-choice campaigners got their act together.
When the Dobbs decision came down, I think we saw this across the country, but I can tell you here in the Kansas 3rd, I saw it and I heard from people. People were scared and had tons of anxiety for them, for their kids, for their grandkids, and I think rightfully so. I hope that people can see that getting engaged and making sure that you're making your voice heard. People were knocking on doors and making phone calls. There was so much energy, and I've heard the word excitement used as it relates to our win last night. But it wasn't just that. It was relief.
So is there something to be said here about defeating an anti-abortion measure in Kansas, of all places, that, those in the activist effort here have sort of blunted that momentum of the pro-life movement everywhere? Is this just isolated to Kansas?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's isolated, but I think that Congresswoman Davids' district is instructive. She represents a swing district in the suburbs of Kansas City. I think that her description of the motivation and energy that voters have around this issue is absolutely true. I think this bodes well against the conventional wisdom about how Democrats are going to fare in November, because I do believe that candidates will have the ability to translate this into that same fear that voters are feeling all over the place, which is that their constitutional rights have been stripped and that they have to do something active to protect them. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how candidates across the board are going to turn an issue vote into an electoral vote for their candidacies come the fall. And I know that it's competing with a lot of other issues, but Democrats actually have some momentum on things like guns and inflation with the reconciliation bill and abortion rights. And so I would say they're having a really good summer.
So actually, I want to pick up a little bit on this momentum and the efforts by some to sort of blunt that momentum. The Post reports that a Republican-aligned PAC sent out misleading text messages ahead of the vote. Here's a bit of that reporting. The text claimed that approving that measure, which could allow the Republican-controlled legislature to outlaw abortion, would safeguard choice. If the amendment fails, constitutional protections would remain in place, buttressing current law that allows abortion in the first 22 weeks of pregnancy. And it seems like supporters of the amendment used every trick in the book, and yet somehow they still lost on this one.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it was not a winning argument for them, as the Congresswoman and Alexei and I had mentioned, on the merits, right? When you're trying to get someone to vote a way they don't feel comfortable voting by lying to them or sending them a misleading message, it means that you don't believe that on the merits you can persuade voters. Again, you also saw in some of these groups who are trying to persuade voters to vote yes, they were claiming that this didn't actually take away women's rights to abortion and reproductive care, which may have technically been true, but basically that's exactly what this amendment did, and that's what the voters in Kansas understood, and that's why they showed up in the numbers that they did. And again, another thing that kind of speaks to this momentum, and again, it will be interesting to see if they can turn it into an electoral issue versus just an issue vote, but is originally going in, there was a sense that for this amendment, for the no camp to win, that, blue, urban, dense areas would have to outperform in turnout, which they did. Turnout was significantly higher. But it wasn't that the red and rural parts of Kansas voted yes and the blue parts voted no, and the blue parts just overwhelmed it. There were a lot of people in really red, western, rural Kansas who also identified as a Republican, maybe voted for former President Trump, maybe won't vote for Biden again in 2024 if he runs, might not vote for a Democratic candidate in the midterms, but turned out to vote down this amendment. And that does speak to the momentum on the sides of abortion rights activists and believers.
Yeah, Donna, picking up on Ashley's point there, because there is a lot of energy out there in that regard. So here's the rub. You and I have been in these battles, right? These big political battles, and you go out there, you do the messaging, you do the work. What does it say if you have to trick your voters into voting for your side, right? What does that say about not just the probability of your success, but the basic message you're putting out to voters?
Well, it really says that you don't believe in your argument and that you're arguing against the tide. I mean, we know that in Kansas, for example, that, there are rural women and men who also support abortion rights. We're talking about something that was enshrined in their state constitution. It wasn't just a statute that was passed. It was enshrined in their constitution. And again, voters do not like having the idea of having constitutional rights taken away from them, stripped away from them. And so I think that the opposition side really was just not convinced of their own argument. And as a result, they couldn't convince voters of that argument either.
So, Donna, just a final question to you on this. As we step back and we look at Kansas in the rearview mirror, did the campaigners there just write the Post Road playbook for Democrats? Should they be going state by state, putting up measures to protect or expand abortion rights? What's your thought there?
Well, I think the short-term goal has to be elect pro-choice Democrats, people that who you know are going to protect your constitutional rights. And I think there's a strong argument that Democrats have going forward to make an appeal both to centrists, but also to independent voters, to those swing Republican voters. And keep in mind, they're not going to need to win these districts and states by 18%. They can win with 5% and 2% in some of these races, and that may be the difference maker on abortion rights. And so I think it's a good time for Democrats to be really thinking strategically about how to convey this argument in a way that voters are going to embrace them.
Ashley Parker, Alexi McCammon, and Donna Edwards, thank all of you very, very much. Really appreciate it. We've had some sad breaking news to bring to you just in the last few minutes. House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy announcing the death of Congresswoman Jackie Walorski, Republican from Indiana. In a statement posted to Twitter, Leader McCarthy writing, quote, Dean Swire, Jackie's husband, and was just informed by the Elkhart County Sheriff's Office that Jackie was killed in a car accident this afternoon. She has returned home to be with her Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Please keep her family in your thoughts and prayers. We will have no further comment at this time. Our condolences, of course, are with her family. When we come back, more on the primary races yesterday, wins in multiple states for the Trump-backed election deniers from Arizona to Michigan, setting the stage for the midterms and ultimately control of Congress. A look at if Democrats can fend off this new crop of extreme MAGA Republicans. Plus, the Justice Department ramping up its investigation into January 6th and the ex-president's conduct around that day. Pat Cipollone, Trump's White House counsel, subpoenaed by a federal grand jury, what he knows and how his shield of executive privilege may not protect him in